Imagine the tension in a New York courtroom. The air is thick with anticipation. Reporters from CNN, NBC, and other major outlets are scribbling furiously, trying to capture every subtle shift in expression. And at the center of it all sits a man who has, for decades, dominated headlines, boardrooms, and political stages, former President Donald Trump. This time, though, he's not commanding a crowd at a rally or negotiating a multi-million-dollar deal. He's facing something far less familiar to him, the full force of the judicial system. An appeals court has just thrown out the $500 million civil fraud penalty against Trump. This ruling stems from New York State's 2022 lawsuit, accusing him of inflating his wealth and committing fraud. In 2023, a judge found him liable. But this appeals court decision does not erase the finding of fraud. It only eliminates the financial penalty, citing constitutional concerns over the severity of the punishment. The civil fraud itself stands, but the massive $500 million figure has been struck down. On paper, this might look like a win for Trump. His team has been quick to celebrate the decision as a total victory, and unsurprisingly, Trump took to Truth Social to amplify that message. Yet the courtroom drama behind the headlines tells a very different story. It is a story of tension, confrontation, and the collision between a man used to operating above consequences and a system built to enforce accountability. No exceptions. Let us rewind to the moment that had everyone in the room on edge. Trump's legal team had just been denied a motion for a directed verdict, a request that the judge toss the case immediately, arguing it was baseless. The judge, Arthur Engoron, said no, and in that instant, Trump did something that would make history in its own right. He threw up his hands, declared he was leaving, and literally walked out of the courtroom. Secret Service agents scrambled to follow him. Reporters gasped. Observers in the courtroom were stunned. This was not a staged exit or a political stunt. This was a former president rejecting the authority of the court in real time. It is important to pause and consider the broader significance. What happens when someone in Trump's position treats a courtroom as if it were a political stage rather than a place of law? Courts are not just another arena for negotiation or showmanship. They have the power to compel attendance, hold individuals in contempt, and, if necessary, order arrests. They exist precisely to ensure that accountability cannot be evaded. Trump's actions, however, highlight a fundamental tension: the instinct to walk away versus the judicial authority that insists you stay. Now, for the casual observer, it might seem like this is just another headline-grabbing stunt, but the implications run far deeper. Imagine a world where the most powerful people could ignore court orders without consequence. Laws become optional. Justice is no longer guaranteed. And yet, for Trump, walking away is part of a well-established playbook. In business, if a deal goes south or a lawsuit arises, he declares bankruptcy, settles quietly, or launches an aggressive PR counterattack. This strategy has allowed him to avoid accountability for decades. The courtroom, however, is different. Judges are not negotiable opponents. They are arbiters of the law, and their authority is backed by legal mechanisms designed to ensure compliance. During the New York civil fraud trial, Trump repeatedly flouted these rules. He violated gag orders, took public jabs at the judge and the attorney general, and openly mocked procedural requirements. Each time, Engoron had to step in and impose fines, reiterating the basic principle that court rules apply to everyone, no exceptions. Yet Trump continued to push, testing limits, and making the courtroom a spectacle. This pattern raises pressing questions about how courts handle high-profile figures who believe they are untouchable. Consider the potential escalation in a criminal trial. Unlike civil cases, criminal defendants are required to be present. If Trump were to attempt a similar walkout while facing criminal charges, say the 34 counts of falsifying business records in New York City linked to hush money payments, the stakes would be exponentially higher. Judges have far more authority in criminal matters. They could order marshals to physically block exits, hold a defendant in contempt, or even authorize restraint if compliance is refused. Legal experts are increasingly talking about scenarios where the courtroom could be effectively sealed until Trump participates fully. The tension here is not theoretical, it is a tangible possibility. And there's another complicating factor: Secret Service protection. Trump receives lifetime Secret Service detail. Their primary role is to ensure his safety, not to enforce court orders. Imagine the constitutional and operational nightmare if a judge orders marshals to restrain him, but Secret Service agents intervene, believing his safety is at risk. You would have federal agents charged with protection potentially clashing with officers enforcing the law. This is unprecedented territory. Courts are accustomed to compelling compliance from defendants, but rarely from someone with both immense political influence and federal security protection. The constitutional questions alone are staggering, and yet, the reality may demand an answer sooner rather than later. It is also essential to recognize the political dimension. Every move Trump makes inside a courtroom resonates far beyond the walls of the courthouse. A forced confinement scenario, where marshals block exits and he must comply with orders, would likely be spun immediately as persecution in his favor, reinforcing his narrative of being targeted by an unfair system. His supporters would see it as proof of systemic bias, energizing his base. At the same time, it could alienate more moderate voters or those on the fence. It is a tightrope walk, both legally and politically. But beyond politics, the core issue is accountability. The Trump courtroom saga forces the nation to confront a fundamental question. Can the legal system hold the powerful to the same standards as everyone else? If a former president can ignore orders, leave courtrooms at will, and face minimal consequence, the implications are chilling. Courts are supposed to operate impartially, without favoritism. Enforcement mechanisms, from fines to contempt orders to physical restraint, exist to guarantee that impartiality is meaningful. If these mechanisms fail against someone like Trump, what message does that send to future office holders or influential individuals? The risk is clear. It could set a precedent where political influence supersedes legal authority, eroding the rule of law itself. Trump's courtroom exits also illuminate the psychology of power. For him, leaving is not merely a physical act. It is a symbolic assertion of dominance. In boardrooms, on campaign trails, and in negotiations, walking away has always been his tool to signal control, to impose pressure, and to claim moral or strategic high ground. Yet in the legal system, this approach collides head-on with a reality that does not bend to personality or PR theatrics. Courts function on rules and authority, not on who can command the most attention. Every exit, every challenge to the judge, is a reminder that Trump's modus operandi is being tested against one of the most rigid systems in society, the judicial process. Let us look closer at the civil fraud trial that sparked this drama. Trump is accused of exaggerating the value of his properties to secure better loans and insurance deals. The stakes are massive, with billions potentially affected and the future of his business empire hanging in the balance. While civil trials often allow defendants more leeway, they do not always require attendance. The strategic choice to be physically present turns the courtroom into a theater of political symbolism. Every gesture, every outburst, every post on social media is calculated to influence public perception, even as the law moves inexorably forward in the background. The appeals court decision to strike the $500 million penalty does not resolve this tension. It merely shifts the focus. The finding of fraud remains. Trump still faces legal scrutiny, and this ruling could be just one episode in a long, ongoing saga. Meanwhile, courtroom confrontations, potential walkouts, and clashes over compliance underscore that this is not simply a legal proceeding, it is a test of institutional resilience. How far will courts go to enforce rules against someone with Trump's political stature? How will enforcement play out when federal protections and political optics are involved? These are questions that have never truly been answered in American history. The stakes extend even further. How the judiciary handles Trump could establish a precedent for future presidents, public officials, and powerful figures. If courts allow him to sidestep consequences or stage walkouts without serious repercussions, it risks normalizing behavior that undermines the authority of the legal system. Conversely, enforcing compliance demonstrates that no individual, regardless of status, is above the law, a reaffirmation of democratic principles. It is a defining moment, not just for Trump, but for the very idea of equality under the law. Now, imagine a scenario that has legal commentators abuzz. Trump, during a criminal trial, faces testimony that could implicate him directly. Frustrated by a judge's ruling or a witness's statements, he decides to leave. A judge, fed up with gamesmanship, orders marshals to block the exits. Trump, surrounded by Secret Service agents, now confronts the legal authority of the court head-on. The standoff is not merely symbolic, it is a literal manifestation of the tension between political power and judicial authority. The outcome of such a moment could redefine public expectations about the limits of presidential and former presidential influence. In this context, the role of the Secret Service becomes particularly complicated. Their primary mission is protection, not law enforcement. If the courtroom becomes a site of enforcement, they could face conflicting directives. Protect the individual they're sworn to safeguard versus comply with court authority. The constitutional and procedural implications are enormous. Courts have legal power. The Secret Service has statutory responsibilities. Balancing those in a live, high-pressure situation is uncharted territory, raising the stakes even higher. All of this underscores a central truth. Trump's courtroom antics are far more than theatrical stunts. They are a litmus test, a test for the resilience of American institutions. Every walkout, every violation of gag orders, every pointed jab at judges is not just a moment of drama, it is a probe to see how firmly the system can stand when challenged by power, celebrity, and political weight. Each action is met with an immediate legal response: objections, fines, rulings, admonishments. But beyond the courtroom, a larger question looms. Can the system enforce its rules impartially when the defendant is a former president? Can law truly operate above political considerations, media spectacle, and public opinion? These are not theoretical concerns. They are the real stakes of this unprecedented legal saga. The potential scenarios are stark. Marshals blocking exits. Contempt orders issued in real time. Tensions between court enforcement and the Secret Service. Even small procedural moments have the potential to escalate into constitutional and political flashpoints. Every move, every decision becomes a test of authority, a stress test of governance, a demonstration of how the law responds to the audacious. At its core, this saga forces the nation to confront a fundamental principle. No one is above the law. Not a senator, not a Supreme Court justice, not a former president. Courts exist to enforce rules, to compel participation, to uphold accountability. That is their purpose. And Trump's behavior, his public defiance, his theatrical exits, his social media attacks, pushes those boundaries to the limit. Yet within this crisis lies opportunity, a chance to affirm the resilience of legal institutions, to show that rules are not optional, that power does not override law, that accountability applies equally, regardless of fame, influence, or political base. Will the judiciary rise to that occasion? Or will political pressure, logistical complexity, and the presence of federal security personnel complicate enforcement? The answer will define more than Trump's personal legal trajectory. It will set precedent for generations, for how future leaders are held accountable, for how courts assert authority when power is wielded as leverage, for the enduring principle that democracy and law are inseparable. Every ruling, every order, every enforcement action is a statement about whether American institutions can withstand extraordinary stress without faltering. This is the real drama unfolding, beyond headlines and sound bites. It is legal, political, and institutional history being written in real time. The stakes could not be higher, and the world is watching. So, as we watch this drama unfold, keep in mind the stakes. This is about more than headlines or political theater. It is about the authority of courts, the enforceability of law, and the principle of accountability that underpins democracy itself. Every motion filed, every ruling made, every courtroom exit is a thread in a larger tapestry, a story of power, accountability, and the ongoing struggle to ensure that rules apply to everyone equally. Trump's courtroom saga is still playing out, and as tensions rise, it promises to test not only one man's limits, but the strength and integrity of the legal system itself. This is the story of power confronting accountability. It is a story about a former president used to control, now confronted by institutions that cannot be negotiated with or intimidated. It is about legal authority versus personal influence, procedure versus personality, and ultimately, the rule of law versus rule by power. As events continue to unfold, the world will be watching, not just to see how Trump navigates the courtroom, but to see whether our institutions hold firm under pressure. Because in that tension lies the very definition of democracy, the idea that laws apply to all, no matter how powerful, no matter how famous, and no matter how influential.